Greetings, citizens of the world.
This is Virtual Verity.
We are anonymous.
It has cameras and sensors.
It's a podcast.
What if I told you there's a plan to build a city unlike any other on Earth?
It also warned that Bukele's emergency measures allow authorities to arrest anyone suspected of gang activity and suspends constitutional rights.
This is a very historic moment.
In El Salvador, over 3,000 children have been locked up in prisons over the past 2 years.
Do you guys like Bitcoin bonds?
Since coming to power, his tactics have led to the arrest of a higher percentage of its population
than any country in the world.
I'm Mark Bruno, a cybersecurity and conflict analyst. This is Virtual Verity, where I discuss topics at the nexus of technology, infosec, open source intelligence, and modern conflict. Okay, so this is part 3 of the series on Chivo Wallet. If you needed to go back and give the other parts a listen, this is your warning. This will not make sense if you have not listened to the first 2 parts. Part 1 focus on the reasons why the wallet was created in the first place. Again, it's a custodial Bitcoin wallet that was created by the government itself and all the sketchy business surrounding both its creation and the rise of Bitcoin within the country. And then on a note regarding skepticism of the Bitcoin law and measures the government was possibly willing to take to protect the idea. Part 2 focused on the series of massive technical and security failures that happened after the government essentially slapped what amounted to a nationwide digital bank together in just a few months, and the eventual failure to adopt the wallet in general. The alleged massive fraud and lack of staying power caused the product to essentially be a stillbirth. Today's going to end what's left of this sort of move fast and break things approach to running the country, and contextualize the substantial controversies regarding what's been called an erosion of democracy within El Salvador, and the rise of the country's police state. Let's get back to it.
Well into the crypto crash, he was tweeting out about how he was buying Bitcoin, buying the dip. He was holding, he was doing. In general, that seems to be the entire vibe of all of this entire endeavor. I can't speak to his personal corruption.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to put like words in your mouth.
And in terms of how it was implemented nationwide, it's not necessarily that I would call it a grift so much as a horrific gamble, like the sort of gamble you make when the bookie is knocking at your door. Because again, there is a mention of bonds that are coming due in 2023 and 2025. They are negotiating at the same time with IMF trying to get loans. And IMF is repeatedly going to tell them that having Bitcoin as legal tender is not a good idea. Again, 2021, Bitcoin is everywhere. Bitcoin is in the news. Everyone is buying into the dream of Bitcoin. And hearing interviews that Bukele give with like what Bitcoin did, they didn't foresee the crash. They either chose to ignore the warning signs, which again, the entire world did. I'm not going to pretend that that's a unique flaw that this administration had, but they didn't think a crash was coming. They didn't think that it was going to dip as low as it did. And I could see it very clearly the way that it was announced in Miami instead of to the people first. They were trying to get some of that Bitcoin money to flow into El Salvador. I mean, again, bills are coming due. They need a source of income, and at the time, this must have seemed like an incredible fountain of opportunity, especially with how bullish everybody was in. Like, there's going to be like comparisons to startups. There's going to be comparisons to companies, because that is what this feels like. They're trying to get the investor cash, as much capital as possible, and they're hoping for eventually the hockey stick to happen. Like, eventually enough money is going to flood in that this is going to be worthwhile, that this is going to be a success, and this is going to be like a fix for a lot of issues. Because they're making gambles. Another thing was the fact that they were spending so much money on this project while there were so many other social programs that could have used that cash.
Oh yeah, and how they were going to make like a Bitcoin free trade zone city and all the infrastructure investment that was going to take. Yeah, I know you haven't dug much into Bitcoin City, but from what I understand, they were going to undergo this massive infrastructure project that was going to divert geothermal energy, originally planned to sustainably develop the country and power homes, again, in an impoverished country, for free. They're now planning to use it to mine Bitcoin and power a city that effectively won't produce tax revenue.
That I didn't hear about. I heard about how that Bitcoin City site was a reused site from something else, but that part I'd never heard about.
Okay, actually, let me be a little more accurate about that. Won't produce tax revenue outside of a 10% sales tax. So no income tax, no capital gains, no property tax, no payroll tax, no municipal taxes. I know in here in Europe and in some other places, the municipal tax is put directly on renters, but it's usually put on property owners. Okay, I think it's time for the Bitcoin City digression, which is just another layer to the dystopian element of this whole thing.
So we were thinking of building Bitcoin City. Over there you have El Salvador, you have the geothermal plant, here you have the power plant, and close to there you have the Golfo de Fonseca, the Fonsecan Gulf.
And if you don't remember, that was the voice of El Salvador's president Nayib Bukele. This is at Bitcoin Week 2022 officially announcing and revealing the broad strokes of the plan for Bitcoin City. It shows this futuristic city and all these cool maps and everything. The next voice you're going to hear is someone not mentioned in the interview, Samson Mao, the CEO of Jan3. Just sounds like another flim-flam man trying to sell another financial product. Except that the product is supposed to be the futuristic hopes and dreams for a rising Latin American nation.
We're going to be issuing Bitcoin bonds. Do you guys like Bitcoin bonds? And these bonds are amazing. The first one is going to be a $1 billion bond. And what makes it a Bitcoin bond is because it's backed by Bitcoin. So half of the $1 billion will go into buying Bitcoin. So the president is going to market by $500 million of Bitcoin.
That also. We're gonna buy $500 million in Bitcoin.
We'll see. The other half will go towards infrastructure, specifically building energy infrastructure and Bitcoin mining. So this is why it's going to be called the Volcano Bond. And this is going to be a series. So this first bond is called the EBB1, or El Salvador Bitcoin Bond 1. But there will be more.
All right, so for the rundown of Bitcoin City, this info I got here is from a combo of snippets from Finbold, Business of Business regarding the info, the financing of the project, and Diario El Salvador. These are generally considered favorable publications to Bitcoin and the Salvadoran government in the case of Diario. So the whole thing was announced by Bukele during the Latin American Bitcoin and Blockchain Conference in 2021. Bitcoin City was pitched as a futuristic smart city that would be powered entirely by geothermal energy from the Conchagua, again, pronunciation, volcano. The goal is to create a self-sustaining hub for Bitcoin mining, commerce, and tourism to basically solidify El Salvador as a global center for cryptocurrency enthusiasts and investors. I kind of picture it the way Dubai has changed the common perception of the UAE in the last few decades. Bitcoin City will allegedly offer a range of financial incentives, including zero income, property, and capital gains taxes. The only tax residents and businesses would pay is a 10% VAT or sales tax, half of which go towards funding the city's infrastructure. I just want to point out that there's a bunch of research that shows that this tax model disproportionately hits working and middle-class people. Economists broadly refer to it as regressive. Don't let the shiny veneer fool you. This is just the flat tax that's proposed by a number of conservative politicians in the US and Europe, typically at the behest of conservative think tanks. At the heart of the project are so-called volcano bonds that you just heard about from Samson Mao. To re-clarify, it is a $1 billion bond issuance meant to fund both the construction of Bitcoin City and the purchase of additional Bitcoin itself. The bonds are designed to be sold through platforms like Bitfinex with an annual interest rate of 6.5%, paid out to investors for 10 years. So keep in mind, Rose just went on for the past hour-ish about how much debt the country is already dealing with, some of it better than others. And food for thought, let's keep in mind that many crypto exchanges have a pretty colorful history when dealing with US regulators. And more in my wheelhouse, just going to use Bitfinex as an example on how bad some of these are on security. Bitfinex itself already had a major theft of nearly 120,000 Bitcoins in 2016, which at the time of recording is valued at nearly 7 billion USD. The CTO of Bitfinex was attempting to address concerns this past April that more data might have been stolen by a ransomware group. I'm not going to name them, it's pretty cringe. And it also looks like that the leak was largely a bluff from the threat actor. But researchers found that the data dump by the attackers had 5,000 records that matched active Bitfinex users. Samson Mao and other architects behind the Bitcoin City project have argued that Bitcoin's projected growth will make these bonds highly profitable. But as mentioned again by Rose before, their projections were based on an assumption that one Bitcoin would be worth over $1 million US by the time the bonds matured. If Bitcoin's value does increase to that level, the government will sell portions of its holdings to pay off the nation's foreign debt and generate dividends for bondholders. Sounds a little bold if you ask me. I don't think I need to do another digression within this digression about how volatile Bitcoin is. If Bitcoin's price doesn't rise as forecasted, the consequences could be pretty dire, not only for bondholders, but for El Salvador's economy as a whole, which already establishes under heavy scrutiny by global financial institutions, such as the IMF. I don't know if we want to frame this as an opportunity cost or whatever, but just think about the resources being funneled into Bitcoin City. With major social issues, including poverty, healthcare, and education, still plaguing much of the country, I think it's a titanic understatement that many Salvadorans question whether or not their government's focus on cryptocurrency is the best use of national resources. My personal take is it's an example of very misaligned priorities. Looking at the environment, although Bitcoin City is promoted as an environmentally friendly, geothermal-powered metropolis, Bitcoin mining is inherently energy intensive. I don't think there's a guarantee the project is going to be as green as it seems. Its volatility in price kind of goes hand in hand with the volatility of its operating costs as the project scales. Again, Bitcoin was an idea created to facilitate private transactions, not hold up national economies, no matter what the crypto optimists try to tell you. While geothermal energy does reduce the environmental impact compared to traditional mining methods, I don't think it's a huge leap to conclude that perhaps the energy could be better utilized for other, more pressing national needs. Where we're at right now, it's similar to the AI trend in the US, where you've got tech giants. I believe Microsoft is talking about trying to get the government to reopen some nuclear facilities to power their data centers. I wonder where that's going to go. The growing concerns about the transparency and social inequality. Many believe the project disproportionately benefits wealthy foreign investors and cryptocurrency elites. Public consultation has been limited, so people haven't really had a chance to voice much concern beyond just throwing some protests. And many Salvadorans feel left out of the decision-making process. I think it's obvious this is a project designed to benefit a wealthy elite the most, and again, channeling what we see in places like Dubai. Bitcoin City is undeniably ambitious, but it's also a risky and polarizing venture. Its success is contingent on unpredictable swings within a cryptocurrency. Are we willing to build a society on this? Another big elephant in the room, Bitcoin City sounds like it's basically just another free trade zone, or an FTZ with a fresh coat of paint. Bitcoin City is supposed to be a bold and innovative leap towards a digital future, but it has so many parallels with existing free trade zones around the world. Like many FTZs, Bitcoin City offers attractive tax incentives and regulatory freedoms designed to draw in foreign investors. However, the benefits often come with significant risks, usually to the people who live in the country that hosts them. History of FTZs, particularly in Southeast Asia and the Middle East, reveal that such zones can become hotbeds for financial crimes, including money laundering and tax evasion, due to the weak oversight and transparency. I'll highlight here that in Southeast Asia, the weak oversight of free trade zones found in Myanmar, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia have caused them to become major centers for cybercrime, multi-billion-dollar scam operations, human trafficking, and varying levels of control by Chinese crime syndicates. I've written about this in a few other places, both here and on the blog, and at my day job. And yeah, I'm not particularly confident that a Bitcoin city state built up to be the biggest market in the world for a favorite money laundering tool wouldn't fall quite quickly to organized crime, especially given El Salvador's history. Another thing, FTZs are frequently criticized for exacerbating social inequality. They don't offer the local population much, no matter what people want to say about job creation. They're usually vulnerable to labor exploitation and environmental degradation. Bitcoin City, from all I've seen, promises to follow in the same path, creating a bubble of economic activity that benefits a select few, while failing to address the broader needs of El Salvador's citizens. This is all assuming, of course, that Bitcoin City even gets built. As of summer 2024, there's still some rumblings of investor interest. The price of Bitcoin has gone back up, and an investment, I believe, is getting locked in for the airport and shipping facilities. But 2 years later, the volcano bonds are nowhere to be found.
Again, he is young, he is very online, and he is bringing modernization to El Salvador, and he's doing it in the same way that startups do it. Move fast and break things, undeniably. And instead you're bringing your entire nation alongside with you. I am somewhat negative on crypto the way it is, but there is a part of me that still believes in the dream of what it's promising. Because I understand, like, state subjugation is something that does happen around the world.
Oh yeah, I definitely see where you're going with this, and I think I'm on the same page. I just find it interesting that, especially in the case of El Salvador, a lot of the people that want this institutional crypto push seem to be fans, whether they realize it or not, of systems of state subjugation. That'll kind of be where this goes sort of after your interview ends.
Yeah. I mean, my complaints are too numerous to list. Like energy expenditure, the fact that it's supposed to be decentralized, but at this point, there is so much centralization of power. In this specific context, in this context of El Salvador, I need to make it very clear, depending on how negative I might sound on this whole subject. Crypto itself is a very valuable asset. If you held on to your crypto during this entire winter, as Celsius fell, as FTX fell, as SBF got himself arrested, as Binance is getting kicked in, as Tether runs the gamut of stupidity, if you held on, again, you just made a tiny little profit again, because at this point it is here to stay. But it is also now close to the mainstream economic situation. They have the ETFs going on at the same time. If you are a smart, crazy, or lucky investor, you are liable to make a profit. But that is not an ask I would make of an entire nation. That's the fundamental issue, more than anything else. You are making an ask of an entire nation to jump on board with you on this project. Even at the time, people could see how things could go haywire. And then they did, in a very massive way. This is a point that some of the sources made, where this probably would have been a lot worse if Bitcoin didn't crash. The fact that Bitcoin crash derailed so many of the plans that were being made.
For instance?
El Faro reported on them possibly making a stablecoin called Colon Dollars. Again, the bonds were continually delayed again and again and again, nearly 3 years after this was all announced as going on. You have rooters on the ground within 2 years going we are at the site of Bitcoin City and there's no sign of any forms of construction. They made a gamble, it went horribly wrong, and now they're barely recovering, but at the same time, it was a gamble they asked of their people, and their people emerged from this winter basically moving entirely away from it.
Yeah, I'm seeing in a lot of polls, even ones that are friendly to Bukele himself, a lot of people will respond to these newspaper polls with a relatively favorable view of Bukele and the job he's doing. It's still coming out to about, right now, around 9% of people in El Salvador even bothering to try using Bitcoin.
Yeah.
At its height, it looks like it was about 20%, maybe a little more than that. So yeah, I don't know. They're not fooling their own people. So it seems obvious to me who all this is actually for. But you still see this guy getting covered favorably in the news. You see Elon Musk sharing shit that he writes. It's brain breaking. But yeah, now since they've forced the whole population into the database, it's just this derelict, dead mall of an app with everybody's personal information on it.
5 million out of 6 million people just got their data leaked.
All right, Rose, I feel like we're starting to just spin tire now. So I'll let you go. Do you have anything you would like to plug?
If I'm gonna shill stuff, Obscuro Latin America, probably the best source on the narco conflict. Rally Point with Auto Robbie. He has a episode with a 916er, a dude from Sacramento. There is a memorial fund to Cooper Andrews. Yeah, the Cooper Andrews Memorial Fund. I didn't know him personally, but everyone I know who did know him speaks incredibly highly of him. The money going to the fund goes to good causes that he cared about. The Cooper Andrews Memorial Fund. I would happily show that. I guess you can find me on social media, but I don't use it for anything. If you find me online and try to pick a fight, I don't know.
Okay, let's try to recap what we covered so far. Really just kind of finishing up setting the stage. So El Salvador, to solve a number of its financial issues and attract more streams of foreign investment without going through more traditional financial entities, took a huge risk and made Bitcoin a legal tender. Since doing this, most of the country has still not gotten with the program, outside of some specific urban areas. And maybe it goes without saying, but it's also mostly used by a specific demographic of upper income young men. To improve implementation, the government then rolled out the Chivo Wallet application. Just a fun fact, a reminder that Chivo is a word for cool or rad or awesome. So you kind of get the idea what sort of branding they're going for. Again, it's a custodial crypto wallet managed by the government, and they signed up the entire population for it without their consent. So in just a span of a couple months, a new system was put in place that had everyone's identifiable information, down to their confidential ID numbers, photo IDs, passport copies, and other sensitive details. At launch, there was a 30 USD Bitcoin incentive to get everybody on the Chivo wallet when they started using their account. Many abandoned the app after claiming the $30 bonus. Then focusing on what happened next with technical failures and public distrust, it was allegedly put together with a blend of mixed legality and untested technologies that were slapped together quickly and could have led to massive fraud and a host of security issues, which it did. Critics, including various members of the press, and even at the time, medium popular journalists such as Mario Gomez had reported varying degrees of retaliation against them. Rose filled us in on both the failures of the launch and the amount of alleged corruption and fraud that went into the process. You mentioned that all this went in line with his idea of the Bukele administration running the country almost like a startup, with move fast and break things kind of being the North Star of their decision-making process. He closed with his own take, which I tend to agree with, backed by a stack of his own research and quotes from numerous experts, saying that this behavior seemed like the sort of gamble that someone would make with the bookie at their door. Coming off of the threats to various journalists and other corruption is the next place I want to go with this kind of final piece in the puzzle, which has resulted in the April incidents a la cyberintelligentsia. Bukele's leadership style and his decisions are highly controversial. Bucking resistance and coming down on journalists with mafia-style threats is kind of par the course for the Salvadoran government since he took charge. But I still want to leave this next part up in the air for you to be the judge, as it can't be understated. There is an argument that El Salvador desperately lacked stability in both economic and the legal realm. There's a reason Bukele is popular, even if it's not hard to condemn the actions that his administration has taken. So Alessia, you wrote in your article in El Café Geopolitico that, and I hope I'm not misunderstanding the Italian, that all this was going down is, quote, the Bukele government tightens its autocratic grip on the country.
I guess it was a combination of factors that and this is how I saw it at the time, but also not just me. A lot of people, I think, shared similar opinions. It was just like a combination between, security policies, the need for security policies, the attitude of Bukele towards his opponents, both politically, but also just in civil society and journalists and just people that were not in line or did not agree with what he wanted to do. But also just a very clear erosion of some democratic checks and balances that El Salvador has gone through since Bukele took office.
What kind of checks and balances specifically?
I mean, the most glaring one is the term, in Salvadorian.
Oh, like term limits or consecutive terms?
Yes. In the Salvadorian constitution, being re-elected was just not a thing. Basically, his now re-election that happened this year, it should not have been able to happen, but it did because he managed to change the constitution's interpretation.
So just for a bit of clarity, what Alessia is referring to is that the Salvadoran Constitution has been understood since its current form was drafted in 1983 to only allow a presidential candidate a single 5-year term, specifically written to prevent authoritarian rule from taking over the country, which is pretty wise given a lot of what was happening in Central and South America during much of the 20th century. However, in 2021, judges that were appointed by allies of Bukele and his ruling New Ideas Party determined that this was not legal. Opponents challenged the ruling with a pretty explicit wording of an article in the Salvadoran Constitution that says, again originally in Spanish, the presidential term will be 5 years and will begin and end on June 1st, without the person who has held the presidency being able to continue their functions even one more day. Bukele's vice president tweeted out when his nomination became official that new ideas are invincible.
So that would be the most glaring one because, it's very clear, a couple of people in Central America or just in Latin America have done it before. Chavez, Ortega in Nicaragua, where, they had a strong constitution, but then through some loops managed to change that.
Yeah, so a strategy of using the court system to give unprecedented power to the executive branch. Definitely not something that Americans should be paying attention to.
In 2021, he won quite a majority in the assembly, and then it was able to change. few other things, and basically approve or disapprove of the laws that he wanted or not.
I mean, did this earn them any sanctions or anything like that?
The US has been quite vocal about like democratic erosion in El Salvador, and they were quite against him also being re-elected, as it was obviously against the constitution originally.
Yeah.
I mean, there were a few officials that were sanctioned. There were allegations with the collusion of the gangs of, I think, two people from Bukele's administration. They did put sanctions on them. Two things that El Salvador could be like put in the spotlight with sanctions is obviously, again, democracy erosion, but also just human rights abuses. And that could kind of go in a similar fashion as it went in, for example, Ortega's Nicaragua.
What are the parallels you see between this and Nicaragua?
Well, Nicaragua had also quite a bit of like a slow erosion of democracy. I don't know if I'm saying this term a lot, but I feel like it really kind of like expresses the problem well, because it's not that from today the president wakes up and just like cancels all like, you know, parliament or Supreme Court and whatever, but it's slowly an erosion of the checks and balances that were supposed to be there to protect the democracy. And I feel like Nicaragua is a bit further down the path now. I mean, Ortega has been there. I think this is the fourth or fifth presidential mandate that he has. His wife is the prime minister. Is the vice president. So he's the president. His wife is the vice president.
This is fine.
This is completely fine. And in 2018, there've been protests. So, and also that's why I feel like it's further along in the process, because at the moment, I mean, in El Salvador, there's also protests, but Bukele does enjoy quite some popular support. I mean, he did win the elections, although, I mean, a lot of the people that do not support him are not in El Salvador anymore, so can't really vote. Same for Nicaragua, same thing. Like political opponents have been harassed, and people had to escape the country. Journalists, the same thing. So anyway, in 2018 there were huge protests, and this is Nicaragua, and then the US kind of like doubled down on sanctions, and the president is sanctioned by the U.S. government, and creates a bit of a
pattern. Yeah, I was going to ask if this is part of a pattern.
A couple of countries that are going into this direction, Venezuela being the first one, obviously starting with Chavez, now with Maduro. Chavez, same thing. They had a great constitution. He basically, one of the first things that he did also took away the maximum term limit. And then Ortega did the same, and then El Salvador, some people say it is on the same path of this, but then they create kind of like isolated countries, and this I'm talking really like in system of things, but countries isolated from the international world order, let's say, that then have to rely on other partners, supporters, other than sort of like the Western one, or IMF also would not really deal with them much.
So what I did find is, in response to actions undermining El Salvador's constitutional term limits, the U.S. did impose sanctions on several Salvadoran officials. In September 2021, the U.S. Department of State added the 5 newly appointed magistrates of El Salvador's constitutional chamber to its list of officials subject to visa restrictions. Weirdly, Bukele himself has not been directly sanctioned by the U.S. or any other countries for this. The sanctions were included in a 2021 package that also punished several Salvadoran officials for the gang collusion that Alessia was referring to. The following are some relevant excerpts from the U.S. Library of Congress's Congressional Research Service December 23, 2021 update on this particular packet of sanctions. In 2 sections of the report, labeled Democratic Backsliding and Removing Checks on Presidential Power, they wrote an assessment of Bukele and the direction the U.S. government at the time seemed to think he was taking El Salvador. Bukele has governed as a populist, using social media to communicate with his supporters, announce policies, purge officials, and attack opponents. Through 2020, Bukele battled with the legislature and the Supreme Court over funds for his security plan and his aggressive enforcement of a COVID-19 quarantine. In February 2020, Bukele ordered the military to surround the National Assembly to intimidate legislators into approving an anti-crime bill. He ignored the Supreme Court rulings to respect constitutional rights and legislative decisions. Although Bukele remained popular, critics warned about his authoritarian tendencies and possible ties to organized crime. In February 2021, New Ideas, his party, and his allies won a supermajority in the parliamentary elections. On May 1st, 2021, shortly after the new National Assembly took office, New Ideas deputies presented charges against and dismissed 5 magistrates from the Supreme Court's constitutional chamber for inhibiting the government's pandemic response. Legislators then dismissed the Attorney General for having ties to Arena. And I just want to break away for a second here. Arena, while they were in this situation going after Bukele, they aren't necessarily the good guys. I don't know how substantive these connections between these people are, but Arena is like a far-right movement that funded right-wing death squads in El Salvador during the Civil War. It's a whole other thing. It is completely out of my expertise, but basically, this attorney general was accused of having ties to, I suppose, what you could paint as Salvadoran Nazis. The attorney general had been investigating corruption in Bukele's cabinet and Bukele gang negotiations. Both moves were broadly viewed as unconstitutional. The legislature then enacted judicial reform that mandated retirement for all judges over the age of 60. In September, the new Constitutional Chamber magistrates ruled that Bukele could run for another term despite constitutional prohibitions on re-election. Bukele, the legislature, and the new attorney general, who reportedly worked for a U.S.-sanctioned subsidiary of Venezuela's state oil company, lining this up with the things Rose was talking about, have shut down investigations into corruption in the Bukele government while arresting government opponents on related charges. Bukele ended cooperation with the Organization of American States-supported Anti-Corruption Commission as well. The National Assembly passed a law granting immunity from prosecution to anyone involved in pandemic spending, while creating a commission to investigate corruption in past governments. The legislature also enacted a Bukele-backed initiative to adopt Bitcoin as a form of legal tender, which the IMF has warned would be vulnerable to money laundering. The currency's entry into force could endanger IMF approval of a roughly $1.4 billion loan for El Salvador. The Biden administration has made, their words, combating corruption a key part of its strategy to address the root causes of migration from Central America. In May 2021, the State Department declassified a report to Congress on corrupt Northern Triangle, a term referring to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, officials that listed 5 current and former Salvadoran politicians. In July, the State Department released a list of officials subject to visa restrictions for corruption or undemocratic actions. It included 14 Salvadoran officials, including Bukele's cabinet chief, legal advisor, and labor minister. In September, the State Department added El Salvador's 5 new constitutional chamber magistrates to that sanctions list. And I know it's kind of easy to look at this as 2 people not from the country in question, but do you think it's all a power trip or a grift to ride Bitcoin into personal enrichment? I guess it's my general question of what the hell is going on in El Salvador? Like, I know he's really popular. Like, how did they vote for this?
I mean, for sure, there is always an element of that. I also thought it was, I mean, not me alone, but also just a very populist move, a political move, just to really, it really does all feel like a marketing campaign, especially at the time when it happened. But yes, I mean, I would imagine that also is, it would benefit in the end, in the very end, it would benefit only a few amount of people. However, I think it's also a bit of a bad strategy because, I don't know, grift something different than Bitcoin, maybe. I mean, Iran on the platform of security, mostly. And, you know, modernizing, bringing new ideas, literally, that's his party is called New Ideas, right? And is actually El Salvador first president from a non-establishment party. There were 2 parties before that kind of produced all the presidents, and then Bukele won the presidency in 2019. Bring fresh ideas, bring fresh things, and you wanted to be the cool new president, but also with a strong emphasis on security and the fact that indeed El Salvador has been struggling especially with homicide rates. It was one of the countries with the highest homicide rate in the world. When people live in that state of insecurity, many times hardline policies are welcomed because what else can you do? Especially that has quite a short-term impact.
Yeah, just lock up half the country.
Yes. So indeed, if you look at the homicide rates, again, this is publicly available data from the police, right? But that's what we have, so that's what we use for data. I think if you look at 2019 and if you look at last year, it's like the one with the least amount of homicides per 100,000 citizens.
Well, yeah, you're saying in Central America, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, way less. In 2019, I think it was Venezuela, Jamaica, Honduras, Trinidad and Tobago, and then El Salvador. These were with the most. And in 2023, it was the last one. And those, I feel like it feeds into the narrative of the numbers. Like, if you look at the numbers, whatever that may be, whatever we have, Bukele can say this was an improvement. People are killing them like each other less.
Yeah, but how did he get there?
Exactly. I mean, just very hardline policies and arresting over 75,000 people in a span of like a year and a half. I was reading today that I think 1% of the population is in jail of a population of 6.3 million people. And that, I mean, not only is a huge issue for overpopulation in the prisons, and then, with everything that comes with, and issues within the prisons, but also where's due process? How can you arrest so many people? Who are you arresting really? Are there people actually in the gangs? Or are there people that were at some point perhaps affiliated? It's just a lot of, I feel like with this policy, a lot of innocent people can just be caught up in it and end up in jail when they actually didn't do anything because there's no due process. People are just incarcerated, waiting for trial. Indefinitely.
Yeah, so they're in detention. They're not even prisoners yet.
No, exactly. Also, not access to lawyers. Not always they have access to lawyer, and also they can be detained also just on the basis of just suspicion. It's basically guilty until proven otherwise.
Yeah.
So it's really the reversal of what a good judicial system should do. Because this is also possible, I feel like, because like he put the state of exception or of state of emergency. But now this state of exception has lasted for like almost 2 years.
Wait, so speedy and fair trial has been suspended in a state of emergency for 2 years?
I think it's been 22 months that is in the state of emergency. But that was a couple of months ago. So now it might be actually 2 years.
Oh yeah, and then didn't speaking of dominoes, in Ecuador do like kind of the same thing?
And actually very interesting because Ecuador is kind of like the president of Ecuador is saying that Bukele's model is the model to follow. So that's why also all these due process things that because of the state of emergency, authorities can sort of like detain more people without actually having that the burden of proof gets reduced. But again, state of emergencies or of exception should be of exception and not last 2 years. And this, if I remember correctly, he has always favored quite a hardline security measures. And there was at some point, that on the surface, and this is not just Bukele, to be honest. It's been the case before that on the surface, like the government policy is like we crack down on the gangs, and below the surface, they may look at negotiating a truce or talking with the gangs leaders, to see if they can actually reduce the homicides by reaching an agreement of some sort. And this is also something that the US had accused. But he's always been quite like a hard line. And then I think in 2022 there was there was a spike of homicides, something that like in a couple of days like 80 people were killed, and that's when the state of emergency came into place, which I understand, right?
Yeah.
I don't think that's like too out of the ordinary, but has never been lifted since. So.
Yeah, so it's interesting. This is something I remember El Faro, like the newspaper news site in El Salvador, talking about quite a bit. El Faro, you know them pretty well, right? So I crossed paths with them when I was researching the Pegasus spyware a couple episodes ago. And it seems that Bukele or somebody in his government might have directed that Pegasus actually be used on the entire newsroom. Like one way or another, every El Faro employee specifically in the newsroom in 2021, 2022 was found to have had it on their phone. According to the editor-in-chief Apparently, this corresponded with a series of harassment from both politicians and members of organized crime, and he believed it was coordinated.
But again, it's like it's. I don't think it's like a new thing. Like, it's not unheard of that there is collaboration, let's say, between the government and powerful criminal organizations. Yeah. So I mean, the government obviously will always like deny it, but it's not. I wouldn't be surprised. But I mean, I can't say like for sure, right? I haven't. Yeah. I'm not there. I haven't. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I remember this being a thing and El Faro being one at the forefront of, you know. I came across them a lot in my research. I also I went to a presentation also of one of the editors of El Faro, and which was really, really interesting. But basically, yeah, that's also what he was saying, that he, and I think he lives now outside of El Salvador, and it's not safe for him to go back. I feel like, I don't know, like as every investigative outlet or news outlet, you will make enemies, right? And like what you publish is uncomfortable for some people. But I do think that, I mean, the people that I've worked with in these few years always regarded El Faro as being a very, very good news source.
Yeah, my experience, the only people that I've heard anything about El Faro being unreliable are the Salvadoran police.
Yes. Yeah. Most of the academics love El Faro. Yeah. People that I've worked with before, also journalists, considered it a reputable news source. So if they say something, it is very likely to have some, you know, truth to it, basically.
So I think at this point it's kind of safe to call it out that Bukele has established a police state.
If what you care is security, full stop, he helped. But I feel like that also this, like in the end, will, or even like it will benefit some people, right? Obviously, as always. But anybody who is just being wrongly imprisoned, and I'm sure there are many, well, their lives obviously are ruined. The lives of their families are ruined. I find it quite interesting and fascinating, the, like, you know, interplay between security and well, democracy in this case, and what constitutes a democratic society.
Yeah, I mean, like, even the guy who allegedly committed the crime that prompted this whole podcast being recorded in the first place said that he does appreciate that, like, it is safer, but at what cost? One last thing I just wanted to mention before we finally finished establishing the foundation for all of this. According to a 2023 investigation by Human Rights Watch, and I know Amnesty International's report on this as well, of the over 70,000 arbitrary arrests that have taken place in the country, around 3,000 of them have been children, many of whom have been pressured into providing false confessions. And at least according to a report that went out earlier this year, nearly 600 of them are serving sentences for these alleged crimes at the moment. So that doesn't even count the ones in detention. Some of these detainees are as young as 10 years old. That's going to be a wrap as far as state oppression and that part of the story goes. There's a lot I didn't get to cover with Rose and Alessia, but I think we finally built everything up. What I originally planned as the topic for this podcast, the actual leaking of the Chivo Wallet data and all the customer information. When Virtual Verity returns, I'll introduce you to one of the most ambitious and focused hacktivism efforts I've ever encountered in recent memory. Part 4, the conclusion of this series, Enter Cyberintelligentsia. We'll tell the story of their campaign of indiscriminate disclosure, data breaches, and attempts to make the world aware of what's going on in El Salvador and Latin America. Agree with their methods or not, this is a fascinating story and it's still unfolding. Will I try to be fair? Yes. Will I attempt to push back on some of the things they've done? Absolutely. Will I be a little biased? You've been warned. Hey, thanks for listening. If you want to check out more of the work I'm doing with this project, you can go to virtualveritypod.com or themoloch.com. This should take you to the same place. Find me on Twitter and Blue Sky at MarkJBruno and It's Bruno, respectively. The Moloch blog should also be on Mastodon on the InfoSec Exchange. You can shoot me an email at contact@themoloch.com. All writing, editing, planning, and production is done by myself, Mark Bruno. Artwork was provided by CM Kosemen. All music is provided by Chris Delano.
Greetings, citizens of the world.
This is Virtual Verity.
We are anonymous.
It has cameras and sensors.
It's a podcast.
But it turns out someone else may have been watching too.
And just like your phones and social media apps.
And although it was a piece of malicious ransomware on the surface, the attack wasn't really about money.
We are Legion. We do not forgive. We do not forget.